We're here to talk about sport climbing, and in a second, Tomas and I are going to demonstrate a basic sport climb. A few things I want to talk about that you need to think about safety-wise before approaching a sport climb. Things that maybe people don't think about because they think, oh, sport climbing is super simple, you just clip the bolts. That's basically true, but first of all, not every route that has bolts on it is a pure sport climb. You need to do your homework, read the guidebook, and know whether it is actually a sport climb. There are routes out there with a few bolts, but also a section of crack where you're expected to place gear. Another thing to know is not all bolts are safe. There are bolts out there that were placed 40 years ago and the route didn't become popular and nobody's ever replaced the bolts, and now they're loose in the hole and rusty and spinning. These are both mistakes that I made many times when I was learning to climb. I used to go up to Castle Rock State Park above the Bay Area where I grew up, and I had a few quick draws and some basic anchor building gear. And if I saw bolts, I figured I was good to go and I could climb that route. And I used to take huge runouts to get to the bolts, not realizing there was a cam placement. And then in retrospect, I realized that some of those bolts I was leading on were super rusty and placed in sandstone where the holes had probably hollowed out, so they were also loose, and they hadn't been replaced in 40 years. So some of those bolts probably wouldn't have held a substantial fall. So in addition to thinking about whether you might need other gear and learning to assess the safety of bolts, you also need to think about fall potential, as in any lead climbing situation. When you're first leaving the ground, you probably should have a spot till you clip that first bolt. And then when you're getting to and clipping the second bolt, in many cases you're putting yourself in danger of a ground fall, especially as you pull up the rope to make the clip. You need to be aware of that and think about your stance. If you're in a super good clipping stance where you're not going to fall, great, go ahead and make the clip. If you're at the second bolt but you can't find a safe clipping stance, you might need to down climb and reassess. This is sometimes true at the third bolt or even later, that you could take a serious fall and come close to hitting the ground or hit the ground. Think about this too when you're climbing above ledges and other projections. Just because you have a bolt in the system doesn't mean a fall is without consequence. The last thing I want to talk about that you should think about, and I've seen near accidents as a result of people not thinking about it, is how are you going to get down, and does your belayer know your plan? Usually, when you lead a sport climb, you're just going to clip the anchor and lower, and then your partner's going to clean. So usually, clip, clip, tension, lower, but not always. Sometimes you're actually going to tether, pull the rope through, and rappel, in which case the belayer is off duty as soon as you're tethered. And what I've seen happen is the belayer thought that the leader was going to tether and rappel, so the leader clipped the anchor and the belayer took him off belay as soon as they were tethered. The leader was actually planning to pull a bite through, clip to it, and be lowered. And I've seen people just about to lean back and be lowered and then realize there's no belayer on the other end of the rope. So make sure you've communicated before leading or going to clean a climb, which is often when that miscommunication happens. Make sure your belayer knows whether you are rappelling or being lowered. So to recap, you need to think about a few things when sport climbing. Is it a sport climb? Do you need other gear to safely protect the climb? Are the bolts good? You should learn the makes and models of bolts that are out there and how to recognize signs that a bolt might not be trustworthy, such as rust or spinning. Think about fall potential, as always, when you're leading. You're not safe just because there are bolts. If you fall and hit the ground, you can break your leg just the same on a sport climb as you can on a trad climb. Communicate clearly with your belayer whether you're being lowered or rappelling, especially when you go to clean a climb. That's where that miscommunication happens most often.